go ahead and get hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Solomon, and on behalf of the Penn Implementation Science Center and the Center for AIDS Research Implementation Science Core, I am so excited for today's talk. We really have a special guest today who is going to talk about the STEP wedge and beyond, including the ROIO and other rollout implementation trial design. So we'll hear about these methods, and I'll just tell you a little bit about Dr. Smith. He is an associate professor in the Department of Population Health Sciences, Division of Systems Innovation and Research at the School of Medicine in the University of Utah now. And he's an implementation scientist as well as a clinical psychologist. The primary focus of his work, which you'll hear a little bit about today, is both developing and applying novel research methodologies to test implementation of evidence-based interventions, primarily in healthcare and community-based settings. And he's been a leader in the field, and we are lucky to have him today. He said I'll let him do the rest of the introduction just for logistics. If everyone would please mute, that would be helpful, and we will have time for questions. All right, Dr. Smith, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so oh, I am continuing to share. Do you guys see the correct slides? Okay, great. So only one correction. I am now professor and vice chair of research, but that's fairly recent. Yeah, I am happy to take burning questions during the talk. The easiest way for me to see that is to have you use the raise hand function. But otherwise, probably try to save most of the questions to the end. But if there is anything that is very confusing, I would be more than happy to clarify it so that you're not wondering for the rest of the talk. So as the title suggests, we're going to talk a little bit about the stepped wedge design, but that is the most common and probably the design within the broader class of rollout designs that folks are most familiar with. So I'm going to spend most of the time today actually talking about alternative rollout designs that actually go beyond the stepped wedge. So more appropriately, this probably should be called beyond the stepped wedge, but that's okay. We'll start there because that's where most people will be grounded in these type of designs. Some disclosures. I don't know if I need to actually say that this is a conflict of interest. I am the co-developer of the ROIO design, for what that's worth. Clearly not a moneymaker, but whatever. I really have to acknowledge two close colleagues, Hendrix Brown at Northwestern, who taught me pretty much everything I know about this stuff. And then Carla Hemming, who is a world-renowned statistician who has focused predominantly on the analysis of stepped wedge trials. We have a couple of publications together recently on a large stepped wedge trial that was funded by NCI. I do receive funding from the typical funding sources. And of course, whatever I say, I'm sure is not 100% in line with any of my funders' positions. So this is my perspective alone. So I do have a lot of experience with rollout trials. These are all funded trials that use a stepped wedge or other rollout implementation design. So just wanted to just kind of show that I do have, practical experience with all of these different designs. But I'm also going to talk about several that actually have never been done. And that's kind of an interesting thing of trying to put out potential rollout designs for use in implementation science that haven't actually ever, to our knowledge, been tried. So there will be some of those as well. So the goals for today, I will be sharing the defining characteristics of rollout trial designs, really with an eye towards their use for implementation research. There is a huge literature, particularly around the stepped wedge trial, for its use in testing intervention effectiveness. We are really focusing more here on testing implementation strategies and supporting the uptake of those evidence-based interventions. And of course, in most of these studies, we do use a hybrid study design where we are the testing for effectiveness and implementation simultaneously. But really, a lot of what I'll say is really applicable to an implementation trial design, not an effectiveness trial using these rollout designs. We are going to spend a lot of time, as I already mentioned, on going beyond the stepped wedge. We will anchor in that, but then kind of stray quite a bit. And then a good portion of the time is going to be focused on the novel rollout implementation optimization or ROIO design that has gotten a lot of interest in implementation science. And I think you'll see why as we get into the rationale for why we created it and what the goals are. So some history on the stepped wedge design. The first time the term stepped wedge was coined in the literature was by the Gambia Hepatitis Study Group in 1987. This was a trial that had 5 clusters with 17 sites rolled out over a 4-year period. And this was more or less the figure that they presented of what does a stepped wedge look like. I'll get into a little bit more about why we call it a stepped wedge here in a second. Brown and Lilford also kind of put out the defining characteristics and definition of a stepped wedge design in 2006. And these are kind of this is true for a stepped wedge. Some of these things are not true for the whole broad class of rollout designs, but we'll get into the broader class definition here in a little bit. So in a stepped wedge, there are always 2 conditions: a control and a new intervention being introduced and implemented if it's an implementation context. The total time period is divided into 2 sections. So the control and intervention sections, this is done in steps, and you'll see on the next slide what that looks like. Each unit, whether it's an individual or a group, is assigned either randomly or not. There are random and non-random variations of stepped wedges, but they're assigned to the time in the rollout sequence to which they will start or cross over from the control to the intervention condition. This is one of the things that people have really liked in implementation science about rollout designs, is that everyone eventually gets exposed to the implementation strategy or gets the new evidence-based intervention. But there is a period of time that you'll stay in control before crossing over. And so the random assignment is to the position of the sequence. One thing that is true of the stepped wedge and is not true of other rollout trial designs, as you'll see in some figures, is that the stepped wedge requires measurement of all units at all time periods within the study period. And so what that looks like is you have time on your x-axis, you have the number of clinics, hospitals, care teams, et cetera, that's your unit of randomization or just unit of assignment on your y-axis. And the crossover points form steps. So that's why it's called a stepped wedge. Where does the wedge part come in? The wedges are your data. So you have your control wedge data, which is everything under essentially the steps on the bottom left of a rollout design. You can also flip this, by the way, where as you saw, it was inverted in the original Gambia hepatitis study example, but this is most commonly how we look at it. And then on the upper part, the top right, split by the steps, you have your intervention data wedge. And so very simply, this trial design is very powerful from a statistical perspective because you have all the data from the control across all sites that is aggregated to do a within and between site comparison of that data with the intervention data, and that adds to statistical power compared to a standard parallel trial design that actually has half the number of degrees of freedom, because when you add in the time component, you add an extra degree of freedom for that. So as I mentioned already, you would like to have randomization to the sequence that is clearly going to be the most rigorous way to do this. If you're not able to assign the timing randomly, potentially both trust and the scientific rigor can be compromised. When all communities anticipate benefit, we need a fair way to assign them. And so randomization to when is the way that it's done in a stepped wedge. There are some potential equipoise considerations here, where when you go first, you have immediate access to a potentially beneficial intervention or implementation strategy. If you go later, the EBI might be potentially improved through experience. And so there might be, or you might just become more efficient at its deployment and use. And so there's some benefit to basically any point in the sequence of the rollout schedule. So some advantages of stepped wedge and rollout designs more generally. This is very much from a researcher perspective. I think there's additional considerations from both the implementation and community partner perspective, as well as potentially from the participant perspective of who actually is engaged in these type of interventions or type of designs. But from a researcher perspective, some of the ethical issues that might actually lend to wanting to do a stepped wedge over a parallel trial design is that you are demonstrating respect for your community concerns about withholding. So in many situations when you're working with community partners, there might be a strong unwillingness to serve in the control condition. And so they might not sign up for a randomized trial knowing that there's a chance that they'll be in the control condition and either maybe never get the intervention or have to wait until the conclusion of the trial to then get the intervention in more of a waitlist type scenario. Scientists should be concerned too with ethical issues related to withholding. In some situations, let's say, right now in the West, we have a pretty significant epidemic of firearm suicides among adolescents and young adults. It would be challenging ethically to suggest that some people should not get an intervention, that we should withhold an intervention for 2 years just to see if a well-validated intervention actually is implementable. And so designs like this can potentially overcome some of the ethical issues you might face around these implementation trials. There is an improvement over alternative designs with a stepped wedge. Stepped wedge do avoid readiness bias for non-randomized community studies. And testing readiness is not the intervention, right? That's actually typically noise or something we're trying to avoid in these designs is whether or not, being ready makes you more or less likely to be successful in an implementation. And I think contrary to some perspectives in the field, I think this is maybe a concern that's a bit more in the past these days. But stepped wedges are a true experiment, right? Sometimes people put up parallel, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials as the absolute gold standard, and everything else is not really a true experiment. It's quasi-experimental. That's not the case. A stepped wedge really is a true experiment. It does produce strong causal inference when done appropriately. And one of the nice things too is that if you are doing site level randomization or you just have a limited number of sites that you're able to engage or pay for, the stepped wedge trial, because of that benefit in statistical power, often requires fewer sites than a similarly powered parallel cluster randomized trial design. So this is I'm actually going to be talking about several papers today that are part of a rollout design series. Two of the papers are already accepted for publication. We published a paper early this year. The Simon paper actually was published in Implementation Science in early 2025. Hendricks Brown led a paper on what scientific inferences can be made with implementation rollout trials that is very statistically oriented. And this has been accepted for publication in Implementation Science and probably will come out before the end of the month. I'm also working on the kind of seminal ROIO trial paper that I hope to get submitted early in the new year. And then we have a fourth paper that is in preparation about calculating statistical power for rollout implementation trials that also has a really nice R package to assist people. So when we start talking about the broader class, so this is where we're going beyond the stepped wedge. There are lots of different steps. I love this little MC Escher picture or painting to really show that the stepped wedge is just one very specific study design with very specific assumptions and requirements. And we can start to think about other ways to do rollout trials that have most of the same benefits of a stepped wedge and some that introduce new benefits that the stepped wedge actually constrains. So let's get into that. So the defining features of a rollout, again, this is going to be very similar to the stepped wedge, but units are assigned to when, the timing at which they are exposed to a different implementation strategy condition or the introduction of a new evidence-based intervention. You still have randomized or non-randomized trial variants of each of these that we'll talk about. And in true form of any scenario, randomization reduces potential sources of bias. It doesn't eliminate all of them, but it does help. There is benefit to going earlier and going later in the sequence of a rollout design. And all rollout designs have one or more crossovers from one condition to another. So this is something that cannot be done in a stepped wedge. You cannot have two crossovers because you would then not have wedges. You might have steps, but not two. You would not have wedges anymore. In most cases, there is a little asterisk here. I'll show a couple of examples where we include a control site. But in most situations in rollouts, all sites are eventually exposed to the implementation strategy. And so they get that kind of ethical and expectation consideration put aside. So what are some of the general pros and cons of rollout trials? Again, some similarities to the stepped wedge. They're often quite appealing to community partners, predominantly because of two considerations. One is that, of course, every unit that is in the study will eventually get the implementation strategy. The other one is that if you're working with large systems, actually having a staggered or sequenced rollout approach is really good for managing limited resources and the capacity of implementation support teams. So they're not simultaneously having to implement in 16 clinics, for example. They might have 4 clinics and then they move on to 4 more clinics, then 4 more, and then 4 more. And so you're not at any given point, you're maybe simultaneously doing the highest level of support for 8 clinics, for example, rather than all 16. So that's that practical for resource allocations, the ethical things we've already talked about. You also may need fewer units than a traditional parallel randomized RCT because of the between and within site comparison. That's also a pro for us logistically as researchers, but also potentially for community partners. And there is an equity consideration. What are some of the cons? So in most scenarios, because of the time-based rollout nature of this trial, it will take an overall longer duration to get to your final result than a parallel cluster randomized trial. The delayed start for some units can be seen as a negative. If you are assigned to the final sequence in a typical rollout design, you might be waiting multiple years before you're actually crossed over and get the exposure. In most rollout designs, there are no true control units, but as I mentioned, I will share a couple of examples where that is possible. This limits the evaluation of long-term effects and sustainment, but there are other alternatives now in the rollouts that you can actually test sustainment, where in a stepped wedge you really cannot. Couple of other considerations, secular trends, which is true for majority of staggered rollout kinds of scenarios. If you don't specify those appropriately, you can introduce a source of unknown bias or a source of known but unknown bias. So you know it exists, you don't know exactly how it's affecting your trial. So those secular trends are something that are pretty serious. Power assumptions can be challenging. You have both an intra-cluster and an inter-cluster correlation coefficient. And often if you're trying to estimate that not using real data, you may estimate something that ends up hurting your power. You do have 2 times more degrees of freedom, as I mentioned before. So you actually have more power for a smaller number of units. But again, if you misstate or estimate some of those correlation coefficients, it can have a pretty significant effect on your overall power. So these rollout designs, we typically talk about the selection, allocation, and assessment aspects. So our selection and implementation rollout trials is typically going to be a cluster randomized trial, where your clusters are either clinicians, clinical teams, or clinics, clinic locations of care, but it can also be participants, health systems, counties, and other units of randomization. But in the majority of situations, this is going to be a cluster randomized. You'll see some examples where the cluster is a single clinic in each rollout sequence. That's okay. It's still a cluster. But as you can imagine, having clusters of multiple clinics within each stage of the rollout reduces potential sources of bias as well. Homogeny helps in your actual selection of the sites to include, but heterogeneity can be handled with randomization and with larger samples. And larger samples are typically needed to achieve balance across clusters, and that's true for any covariate adjusted randomization or any other kind of randomization approach that takes into consideration characteristics of those units. Again, the allocation is to position in sequence. So when you're actually doing the randomization, it's whether you're going to be in the first cluster, the second cluster, the third cluster, et cetera. The assessment, you're typically going to measure the outcome for a period of time before the rollout, or before the crossover. But there are exceptions. There are rollout trials that actually do not have a control condition. And so I think I will share an example of that in today's slides. But most of them do have a period of sort of control or pre-exposure data that, of course, then gets compared to the post-exposure. The time after the crossover, when you're designing these types of studies, you want to make sure that it's long enough to detect the effect. There is no specified time that you have to have, but for some interventions, the duration to detect the effect takes longer versus other ones where it could be a little bit more instantaneous or just a very, it happens very quickly after the crossover. So we did publish the Simon paper, as I mentioned, in 2025. We had a title that was much more suggestive of people maybe you should be doing more rollout trials, and the reviewers and editors made us change it to say something about how they're often necessary and sometimes preferred rather than our stronger suggested language, but that's fine. So within this paper, we started to introduce basically the ideas that I've just shared up to this point, that there is a lot of rollout trial design options beyond the stepped wedge. And some of the ones that we presented in that paper are funded trial designs. So you can see in panel 1A is the traditional stepped wedge. 1B is a three-phase rollout that introduces two crossover points. And the third, at least in this scenario, is a sustainment period where one would assume that the implementation supports are taken away or significantly curtailed towards the end of the green implementation period. And then we want to see if removing those or turning them over to the health system leads to sustainment of the effect of the implementation or not. In the panel 1C on the top right, this is a head-to-head rollout design. This actually has two levels of randomization where you'll be assigned to the position in the sequence, and then you also then get randomly assigned to get implementation strategy A or implementation strategy B. And then over the course of the trial, we are comparing both strategies to control and strategy A to strategy B to see which one is potentially more effective, more time efficient, more cost effective, et cetera. For panel 1D, this is a single wedge with sustainment period. So this is a situation where there is no control data. And you might see a scenario where you're trying to implement an intervention for a condition that the system that you're working in does not do anything currently. So the actual baseline of practice is 0. So there's no reason to actually evaluate a control period knowing that it actually isn't happening. An example of this could be HIV testing in barbershops. Okay, when those initial studies were done, if they had been done in a stepped wedge or rollout type scenario, the control data would be 0. They weren't doing any HIV testing before, and so in this scenario, you roll out in sequence. And then after a period, you withdraw the implementation support or you turn that over to the system to measure sustainment. So that's kind of the way that works. Panel 1E is a simple parallel rollout with a baseline period. So all sites will have a baseline period, and then half of the sites start the implementation, the other half remain in control. This is essentially a waitlist type design. Where at the end of this, if the intervention or the implementation is effective, the control sites then get the implementation, but it's not that at that point it would be just a wait list where you wouldn't analyze that data after the fact. You also have the waitlist control on the right-hand side essentially is that extension of that design. So these are pretty basic. I'm going to talk about some more examples that get a little bit more complicated or can help you answer slightly different research questions than that. This paper now is in press as of about 2 weeks ago. This paper really does focus on what scientific inferences, so what types of research questions. And as I think I mentioned already too, this is a very statistically heavy paper, so it does include actual equations for how to actually do the analysis to answer these different questions in these complicated rollout designs. So you saw this previously already, but worth coming back to because I think this is one of the places where in a traditional stepped wedge, you can't evaluate sustainment, and sustainment is a really important question for implementation science. And so this gives a variant or a version that you actually can do this. In this particular trial, there was a baseline period of data collection within, these were primary care practices. There was a implementation strategy that was done for 4 months across each of these different clinical sites or cohorts. And then that implementation support that was provided by the university was withdrawn. And there's a period of sustainment to see if the implementation success that was achieved during the green period persisted or whether it waned. We also have a head-to-head rollout design. This basically, this one shows a situation where there isn't control data, but you can add in control data if it's relevant to the scenario you're working in. In this, again, as I mentioned in the previous, you'd be randomly assigned to your position in the sequence, and then you would also be randomly assigned to which of the implementation conditions you got, and that can answer the question of which of the two strategies is better than the other, and are each of the strategies better than control if you have control data to include as well. And as you can imagine, you could also add in a sustainment period where you continue to assess outcomes for all of these, and you can see maybe which of the strategies achieves the most, sustained effect as an alternative. You can kind of start to see the building blocks of different variations of these types of designs, but they do certainly build upon each other to answer different questions. Here's another one that this is one of the ones I mentioned is a conceivable design that to our knowledge has not been done. And so what this basically is this is a fractional factorial design that simply adds a time-based element, a rollout element. So in factorial designs, you typically have 2 or more implementation strategies or interventions, and you assign to either neither one component, the other component, or both components. In this particular example, it's a fractional because we eliminated the neither as a control condition. And so you have in this scenario, again, multiple levels of randomization. You get randomized to your position in sequence, and then you get randomized to the component that you're going to be receiving within that sequence. And as you can see, not all combinations occur at each of the different clusters. So some of them compare component G to component H. Some of them compare one of the components to the 2 components together. But essentially, when you aggregate and collapse the data at the end, you are left with main effect questions as well as the interaction effect question of is G plus H better? So that's sort of how these work. You might be wondering, why would you do this instead of just a typical fractional factorial that all happens simultaneously? And I think it would typically go back to that resource allocation consideration, where it really wouldn't be possible in some scenarios to offer a high level of implementation support with fidelity if you were implementing across all sites simultaneously. So this would allow you to do so. So here is a scenario. This is an actual study that is funded. Hendrix Brown is the lead biostatistician, and Peter Wyman, who's at University of Rochester, is the PI. And in this particular study, they have a rollout design that has a control, a new implementation period, and a sustainment period. But they wanted to also compare this to, control, so that it added a degree of rigor, but also gives you a way to have real data to estimate that underlying temporal trend, which again can be a problem if you don't know what that was, and it can influence the results in ways that you either can't appreciate or don't have the data to really understand exactly how. So this gives two things. It allows you to actually do an analysis of whether or not the implementation and sustainment was better than the control group. And it also allows you to get real data to add the underlying temporal trend into that analysis to reduce that source of potential bias. The only way that this worked, and I think this is a scenario that you really have to consider, because this violates the whole of rollout designs where everybody eventually gets exposed. The scenario that works is when you have what we call naive control sites. So this study is actually a suicide prevention program being implemented at Air Force bases around the country. There are 4 Air Force bases, one for each of the top 4 sequences in the step. And then because the Air Force obviously is centralized, we were able to get permission from higher command to pull data from a control base that doesn't even know we're pulling data from them. They are literally naive to their inclusion in the study. We are only using them to for their data for the control condition, and we're able to do that because of that central nature, and also they collect the exact same data elements routinely as we're using to evaluate the suicide prevention program in the 4 active bases. I don't think I would probably go into most study designs for a rollout with the expectation that I was going to ask one of my sites to be a control. But if you have a scenario like this where you have access to EHR data, you have access to other reported health outcome data that's exactly the same data as you'll have for the trial, you can potentially do this naive control option. This is another one that has a control group. But this one, yeah, this is, I can't even remember exactly what's different, but it doesn't matter. One thing I do want to mention too from the analytic perspective, and this is really true of implementation trials, perhaps even more so than if you were doing this as a typical clinical effectiveness trial, the likelihood of having time average treatment effects is pretty high. And so what this means, and actually if I was going to point you to the paper, this paper by Avi Kenny, that was published in Statistics in Medicine, is a great primer. It's not focused on implementation trials, but it is everything they say is highly applicable to the way that implementation strategies function. Here's what I mean. So this goes to actually specifying your estimand. An estimand is a systematic description of the treatment effect that is going to be quantified in order to answer the trial's research objective or research questions. The left-hand column here, or left-hand panel A, is the instantaneous effect. This is the assumed effect for most types of analytic models that you would run to analyze a stepped wedge, which are typically linear mixed effects models, but there's others depending on the type of outcome that you have, of course. If you do not specify a different estimand, then those analytic methods will assume that what you're expecting is an instantaneous effect right at the point of the crossover that happens repeatedly across your rollout sequence. But there are also other ways that the effect could happen. You could have a lagged effect. And that's what's shown here in panel B, where the crossover happened here, but the effect of the intervention wasn't actually manifest until a delay of a couple of months in this case. You could also have a curved effect where it just simply takes time for the full effect of the implementation strategy to manifest itself in this case too. And similarly for a partially convex, where there are these kind of clear nodes at which the effect shifts and improves over time. So what happens if you don't specify one of these time varying estimands? Well, if you have an instantaneous effect, you're fine. Right? Your actual data and your estimated or likely underlying effect that you had planned to show basically lines up and you're fine. Publish your paper in JAMA or Implementation Science or whatever, and you're good to go. However, if you actually have a lagged effect, but had included an instantaneous estimation, it actually will not be significant because the estimated effect, as you can see, does not align at all with the true data. And so that would be likely a null result. Similarly, for an instantaneous effect within the context of a true underlying curved effect, it would likely underestimate the effect of the intervention and may or may not be significant. The partially convex, at least the way that this one was shown, and of course, a partially convex model could have more of a rapid increase here, slower here, and then increase again. I mean, there's multiple ways it could happen. But this particular example, the instantaneous effect basically would not be satisfied, and it wouldn't even pick up that there was much of an effect at all. And again, it would probably look similar to the legged model. So really think carefully when you're proposing your statistical analysis plans. How do you actually expect your implementation strategy to behave, and that effect to show up and be tracked over time, because this can be a problem. Okay, getting off of the statistical stuff. So, what are some issues with traditional rollout designs for some scenarios in implementation science? So, the assumption, especially in a stepped wedge, and is typically true for any of these other rollout designs where you're going to be combining all of the data from the different phases, the implementation phase, the sustainment phase, et cetera, is you really have to ensure that all units get more or less the same exposure, right? You can't be changing your implementation strategy between clusters and combining the data to say this is, a specific strategy was related to the effect. That would violate several assumptions of these trials, as well as your ability to infer what caused the effect that's observed. In implementation science, I think we probably rarely satisfy this, to be honest. There's often learning or sequence effects, meaning that you might just get better or more efficient at the implementation strategy. And so people later in the rollout sequence, what they actually get really is kind of qualitatively a little bit different, even if it is technically the exact same strategy. In a traditional clinical trial, if things get better over time, if you see a sequence effect that clearly shows later in the rollout sequence, people are doing much better, that is typically a pretty significant problem. And my more dyed-in-the-wool clinical trial biostatisticians that I work with really want you to do things to avoid this type of a situation. But in implementation, we might actually want this. And so this is the motivation for the ROIO design. So in a scenario where you best intentions, you've done really good preliminary work, but you realize and learn through data in the first cluster or two that your implementation strategy is not really working very well. Okay, it might be not working at all. It might be not working nearly to the extent that you expected it to. What do? Do you change it? Can you change it? Is that even permissible within a typical stepped wedge or rollout trial? And if you can change, what do you change, right? What are you allowed to change? What's not going to violate all these different rules? So this really can be a pull your hair out situation. Best case scenario, if you realize your strategy is not working in the first cluster, you change the strategy moving forward and you dump cluster one. They become basically a pilot cluster that doesn't get included in the primary analysis because they got a different exposure. If you can catch it early enough in your sequence before you launch in cluster two, that's like the best way to resolve this issue. But if you actually want to test whether or not you can improve on an implementation strategy over time, you might consider a ROIO design or a rollout implementation optimization design. So what a ROIO does is it helps you answer the question, can we identify an optimal implementation strategy through iterative improvements between units and clusters? You can imagine the definition of optimal can differ. So you definitely need to define what data you're taking into consideration when determining which of the strategies is optimal. But we'll get to that in a second. In a ROIO, the optimization or tailoring feature is planful. It is prospective. It is built into the study design. This is not, you can't start a stepped wedge, realize you need to make changes, and then start calling it a ROIO. It doesn't work like that. And you'll see some of the things that go into the way that you actually propose a ROIO that make that the case. So in a ROIO, you actually use early quantitative and qualitative data from cluster one to inform tailoring of strategies for cluster two. You use the same type of data from cluster two early in the rollout to change cluster three, et cetera. So you have multiple times where you'll get to try to optimize the strategy based on the data from the prior clusters. So there are some assumptions that you kind of need to satisfy. In most ROIO scenarios, your first implementation strategy bundle or package, whatever you want to call that, it typically has to be multiple strategies so that you have things to play with and optimize over time. Or it could be just a complex multi-component single strategy, again, that has enough levers and buttons that you can push in the optimization process. But essentially, you need to go into cluster one with an implementation strategy that is likely to work. You don't want to actually like put your hand, tie your hands behind your back and say like, well, I think these are the components that are really going to be good. Let's save those for later. Because what you're really trying to do is put your best foot forward and then see if you can get better from there. But there could be an argument to be made that you might want to save a more costly or less feasible strategy for a later cluster and essentially have it in your back pocket, knowing that at some point you will implement it, but it shouldn't be part of the initial bundle for practical reasons. Again, the bundle needs to be tailorable, meaning it can't be like a super simple strategy that really doesn't have ways that you can change its form. And so that's where complex multiple component bundles and packages of strategies actually are most well suited to ROIO. ROIO is also not a couple of things. So if you are planning to simply test 3 pre-specified implementation strategy bundles, that's not ROIO. That's just a 3-arm trial. And so if you have 4 clusters or something like that, if you have combinations, you're looking at a factorial. It really depends on, kind of what your research question is and what you're going to put forward. But really, if you're saying, I have a complex multi-component strategy, I want to see if over time and with data, we can improve on the effectiveness, cost effectiveness, you're in ROIO territory. If you're saying, I want to know the best combination of strategies, you're kind of in factorial territory, or some other kind of optimization or adaptive trial design. If you have 3 strategies and you want to compare them, 3-arm trial. It's also not a fishing expedition. So this is not just throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall, seeing what's working, taking the stuff out that's not, adding some more stuff in. Again, this goes into the idea that these are very planful and prospective approaches to the optimization of your implementation strategy. So what are some methodological challenges? Strategy selection, not surprisingly. It is done a priori. It needs to be done typically with your implementation partners and be well justified. We use the implementation research logic model that I am the lead developer of, so that's not surprising that we use one of my tools. There are other logic models and things that you could use, but we do find the IRLM is really well suited. And when you're coming up with your strategy package, what other discrete strategies might you put in the parking lot for use later in the optimization? So it's not that we'll identify 15 discrete strategies and we're just going to throw all 15. We typically have a prioritization process where we're trying to identify the most effective, most likely to be effective, most feasible to implement, and that cover the majority of the main barriers that are known to exist for the implementation. And then you have additional strategies that can get plugged in later as you go through. How many clusters and steps do you need? Kind of depends on the preliminary data, the nature of the implementation strategy, how complex it is. Do you need 2 attempts, 3 attempts, 4 attempts? Every time that you add an attempt, add 1 more to that'll be the number of clusters. So if you need 4 attempts, you need 5 clusters in your rollout sequence. More evidence-based strategies may need fewer bites at the apple, fewer attempts, because the evidence base is really strong. In your actual rollout schedule, you need to have sufficient time between clusters for the optimization process to occur, which means you need enough time to collect data, to process that data, to get input on what the data is saying, to make decisions about what is going to be changed for the next sequence in the rollout, where you have to actually have time to prepare that too. So I will talk about this later, but in most of these trials, we're looking at like a 9-month step, which is much longer than a traditional like stepped wedge step. Those are usually 3 months, 4 months, 6 months. But 9 months we've found is kind of what it takes to actually get all those pieces done in time to roll out in your subsequent sequence. You also have to identify tailoring metrics. So you need to identify metrics that are sensitive to change and actually offer you actionable data. So, working in health systems where you have access to EHR data, Several metrics from the EHR could be potentially used, but you also can do, of course, your own primary data collection to figure out what is working and what's not. You also need to have analysis methods that are rapid and informative of needed changes. This is not like statistical methods typically. We're using things like short control charts, as well as some other more like quality improvement type ways of understanding the data to think about, okay, was that level of significant change or not? You can use little like interrupted time series type analyses as well. And then for qualitative data, we use rapid qualitative analysis to really get really quick down and dirty data to make decisions in that process. And then you also want to have at least some thought about the thresholds and process for how you make modification decisions. It should be protocolized, and it should be a replicable and transparent process that someone else could use, or at least understand exactly how you did it. So those are some of the kind of tricky sticking points that I'm going to be covering in the in-process ROIO paper that like I mentioned, I hope to have out early in the new year. So here's an example of a ROIO. This was in the context of pediatric hypertension. It's a very under-recognized condition. So what we were trying to do is increase the adherence to the clinical practice guidelines, which have already been shown if you increase adherence to the guidelines, they're more likely to identify kids who actually have hypertension, and those kids then get treatment. So the primary aim was to optimize a multi-component implementation strategy package to improve identification of children with hypertension in safety net health centers. Our optimization data, we relied heavily on the EHR, and then we did rapid qualitative analysis of staff focus groups. We had a blood pressure champion that we did interviews with within each cluster, or actually each clinic, so multiple clinics within each cluster, and then had physician interviews as well about how things were going. This particular design, we thought we needed 3 bites at the apple. So we have 4 clusters with 6 clinics per cluster, 24 total clinics. There's a 12-month period of implementation preparation, which is essentially this kind of turquoisey colored thing here, or teal, I guess maybe is a better way of saying that. And then this is the actual crossover to when cluster 1 starts. This initial gray data is the data that you'll use in the time period for the optimization process that I just discussed. And then this cluster continues to implement for an additional 15 months in this, or sorry, additional 18 months in this scenario. This could be extended. There's no reason that these can't go all the way to the end. We did realize, though, in our power analysis that for some reason, having less data, but having the data be exactly the same in this kind of stepped fashion at the end actually produced better power. So that's why we proposed to do it this way. So the red is essentially showing that you're using this data to then inform what the cluster 2 gets. Cluster 2, of course, is informs cluster 3, and cluster 3, cluster 4. So what can you do in the optimization process? So as I mentioned, when we identified the bundle, we prioritized it with our community partners as components that were likely to work and were feasible for them to implement. We used an adapted Delphi process as well as the IRLM, and this Knapp Carroll paper from 2022 actually is a methodology paper about this process that you can go see in Implementation Science Communications. So what can you actually do? You can add new strategies in between bundles. So for whatever reason, maybe the strategy you picked to overcome a significant barrier like really didn't. And so you need to maybe add another strategy to increase the effect or try to overcome that barrier. You can remove ineffective or infeasible strategies. So, if something is really showing absolutely no signal and is not having an impact on the thing that you thought it would, maybe take it out. When you have the IRLM and have all the strategies, not just the ones that were picked for cluster 1, you've already mapped out the causal paths and the logic for why that strategy is thought to work. And so you can go back to your logic model, look at the strategies that are not yet in use and say, okay, is there a strategy that addresses the barrier that this ineffective strategy was addressing and or operates through a similar or a different mechanism to achieve the same target outcome like reach? And so having that pre-vetted, that planful approach can really make your life easier and then justifying why you've added a new strategy or replace a strategy with something different. You can also change the strategy itself without removing it or adding to it by changing the intensity, like the dose or the frequency, potentially changing the person that does it. So the actor, maybe you realize that, hey, the physician's not doing this, but actually the MA could. And so a task shifting type approach, not changing the strategy, just changing who actually does it and who's responsible. So how do you actually analyze this? In this particular study, we were looking at primary outcome of rate of accurate diagnosis. So we have rates that are gathered by month. And so we had proposed two different ways of looking at this. So the first one was a time to criterion over 18 months that compared the initial cluster to later clusters. This only allows you to answer the question of, did we improve upon the initial strategy package, right? So you're using essentially the initial cluster as your anchor or your kind of control comparison. You're aggregating the later clinic or later cluster data to be the non-parametric comparison of the initial versus later, and that's a Kruskal-Wallis test. The more common way that we would do it is a multi-level trajectory analysis, where you're basically asking the question of, did we improve over time between each cluster? And so you'd have like four actual curves and a test of whether or not the curve itself significantly was better than the other curves. Power, not that important for this, but yeah. The other thing that we've tried to encourage people to do is for determining the optimal strategy, it really shouldn't rely only on effectiveness of achieving like maximum reach or maximum fidelity, whatever it is. You also want to consider incremental cost effectiveness ratios. So essentially what this is comparing, was the cost and effectiveness of package A better than package B and vice versa. And so in this one, we had standardized the cost per implementation of 100 children and the effectiveness percentage of improvement in diagnosis. And the reason that this is important is, yes, you might be able to continually add strategies to eke out a larger actual effect on reach, for example. But if that comes at diminishing return or increased cost, it may not be worth it. And so if you had, maybe a really good scenario would be by the third cluster, you've basically maximized your effect. Let's see if we can take away some strategies to make cluster 4 more cost effective. And maybe that would become the optimal strategy, not the one that actually had the highest effect. Just very quickly, because I want to make sure we have a couple of minutes for questions. Here's an example of another ROIO trial that I think is more akin to like a ROIO pilot type trial. So this was 4 individual clinics that had a staggered rollout. They were all within the same federally qualified health center system, all in very close proximity in downtown San Diego. And so this was kind of a lot of homogeny among the sites. And so one per rollout sequence, trying to improve on the implementation. So it's just an example that you look at in the literature. I also co-lead a P50, an alacrity research center called the Mental Health Earlier Center at Northwestern with my colleague Lori Wachschlag, where we are testing a ROIO split plot design. So this is essentially a intervention that gets implemented, or an implementation strategy that starts in the green. And then after a period of time, we have additional implementation strategies that get brought in. And so we can more or less test this in a 2-phase factorial design. And so because you add in these additional pieces, you can answer a number of additional research questions about whether or not there's an additional increased effect on the overall effectiveness of the primary intervention with these additional implementation strategies. But I won't go into too much detail about this just for the sake of time. This will be in a future paper as well. So some future directions, some things that I've been really trying to get on paper is guidance on how to do their tailoring variable selection. What are good variables? What is your process for optimization? So thinking about different group model building, consensus type approaches, other things. Do you do weighted decision making where your partners might have more of their preference might be taken with more weight than others? The need for really comprehensive and accurate strategy tracking. So you really can, if you have a difference between clusters 2 and 3, you can really say, these are the differences. These are the exact things that we changed in between these clusters that are responsible for that difference that we observed. And then providing some more guidance on additional analysis methods and considerations for different data types. So that's the end. I'm happy to take questions here for the final 4 or 5 minutes that we've got. I'll stop sharing so I can see your lovely faces.
Thanks, JD. I think maybe a good place to start would be the chief of access a bum box of chat, but it's in there.
Yeah, so Mohammed's question, how do we balance site readiness and randomization? Often see that not all sites are at the same level of readiness and time is a limiting factor. Yeah, really good question. There are pseudo randomization measures. This is a really tricky thing though. So if you're basically favoring people who are ready to start first, it is by its very nature now not random, right? And we've had scenarios like this. I have a paper that just got accepted in implementation science of a stepped wedge trial that we had 7 clusters, and the health system told us these clinics are starting first, and so cluster one was non-randomized, so they are not included in our primary analysis. Only the actual sites that were randomly assigned to their positions 2 through 7 are actually included in the primary analysis. We did do a sensitivity analysis, including cluster one, to see if it significantly changed the results. It did not, but they were not officially part of the primary outcome. Yeah, it's hard. There's also another randomization method called batched randomization for a stepped wedge. That may be a solution to this, but I'd have to do a little bit more thinking. There's a 2022 paper in Statistics in Medicine about the batched recruitment approach for stepped wedges. Um, Sean, yeah, do you want to just say it since you're on video?
Oh yeah. So just more of a comment. So Vanessa's on the call too. So in implementation practice, like we serve as an intermediary. So we definitely see this of that sequence effect where naturally the team gets better because they're getting more reps and practice. And they get supervision, we bring in data, et cetera. And then the next time we do it, it's effectively better. So I just perked up with that because in practice, like that's just a natural consequence of doing the work.
Yeah, I think you're right. So building in to your analytic approach and to your hypothesis that you expect a learning effect or a sequence effect. I think what's important though in those is that it really is a true learning effect, that it's not actually we've changed things. And so the exposure is different. If it really is that you're getting more efficient and better, that's not a bad thing. I think it just needs to be stated up front. Typically, it's a problem when it happens and you didn't want it to happen and haven't accounted for it. So if it really is expected, it's a little easier to deal with because you can really be transparent and build it into your analytic approach.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I love this too, just the idea of equity too, of like if we have something that works, I feel like people deserve to get it. So thank you for this.
Agree. Yeah. Yashu, do you want to ask your question? Nice to see you, by the way.
Yeah, good to see you. So, I was just wondering, like, I saw you show that graph about the different sort of the optimized strategies, but like, do you sort of consider them same strategies? And so, like, I'm just thinking in terms of analysis. Is there any other additional way to actually look at from the analysis perspective?
So I might have glossed over this point, but kind of the idea that if you're going in with like 3 different strategies or 4 different strategies, a ROIO is not really a good way to do it. The best way to kind of approach this and think about it is I have a complex strategy. Yes, it's comprised of different components of discrete strategies, but essentially you're testing the bundle. There are situations where you might pull a specific strategy out, and that's the only change you make. And so you can really say, like, well, what about the bundle without X strategy? But for the most part, you're really trying to come from a strategy package that you test the iterations of that package. So it's really like package, package 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, not package 1, 2, 3, 4. If that makes sense. It's iterative refinement of kind of the same thing. They will be different, but again, if it's like 4 completely separate strategies where you just like throw one away, start with a whole new thing, that wouldn't be a ROIO. That would really be just a comparison of different strategies, not iterative comparison of improvement. Yeah.
Okay, since we're at the hour, thank you so much, JD, for this wonderful talk. I think there's a lot that we learned. The slides will be available in the C4 website. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And just on a personal note, I met JD, I think more than 10 years ago already. It
Yeah,
feels
about that.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, when we were just starting with the ending the HIV epidemic and implementation science. And I learned so much from you back then, and I'm still learning from you now. So thank you again,
Yeah,
and
thanks for
have a
inviting
good
me.
afternoon, everyone.
Yeah, thanks all.